Thank you, Bob, for that kind introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, good morning. I'm still a little bit jet lagged, so I need some good morning welcome. Good morning. All right, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I want to thank Marion and Lynn and everyone who has organized this exciting event and invited me here. I'm really grateful to be here, and so thank you to all of you for being here as well. I want to take a second to also acknowledge one of our water keepers is in the room. That's John Weisheit, our Colorado River keeper. Where are you, John? There's John. I'm really glad to have been able to call John my friend for the past 15 or 20 years, and he's an amazing soul and an incredible advocate, so I hope you'll please support his incredible work. Also, one of my colleagues from Waterkeeper Alliance, Catherine Lucier, is also here in the room. So thank you, Catherine. I'm really excited to be back out here in the American West. It's a place full of so many of our nature's treasures, from the tallest mountain peaks in the country to some of the most mystifying deserts. You've got pristine ski slopes and forests that are teeming with wildlife and cities that are teeming with culture and innovation. And in particular, being out here in Utah is really exciting for me because I feel fortunate to have been able to come out to Utah pretty much every year for the past decade or so, and usually more than once a year. And it's just such a beautiful, magical place, and you're very blessed with so many amazing natural resources and treasures. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm thrilled to be here to share a story about citizens who push boundaries and are willing to challenge the status quo. I'm going to tell a story about citizen action and innovation. And it's a story about people who are willing to, they find a problem in their community and they're willing to ask the question, what can I do? And get involved and take citizen action. You know, asking the question, what can I do, is answering that question is often very difficult, but asking it, it's a really important question that needs to be asked. So I call this story The Power of Possibility, the birth of a movement, and the rebirth of our waterways. So for a little bit of background, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, Waterkeeper Alliance is an international movement uniting more than 300 locally based clean water advocacy organizations and focusing citizen action on issues that affect our waterways, from pollution to climate change. We currently have 302 waterkeeper organizations in 34 countries on 6 continents. And together they patrol and protect about 2.5 million square miles of watershed. There are waterkeepers we have in China, India, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Togo, Kenya, Senegal, Australia, Peru, Ecuador, Czech Republic, Sweden, Russia, across the United States, across Canada, and beyond. So they're a very diverse bunch. They've got very diverse backgrounds with different languages, different religions, different cultures, and different political systems and different legal systems. But they all have, what they all have is a common bond that everyone has the right to clean water, and they're willing to stand up and take citizen action to fight for that right. So they're up every day fighting for a world where everyone can go down to their local waterway and jump in and have a swim without fear of getting sick. And they're fighting for a world where everyone can go to their water source, fill up a glass, and drink it without fear that they're poisoning themselves with toxic chemicals. And they're fighting for a world where everyone can go down to their local bay, or river, creek, stream, pond, throw in a line, catch a fish, and bring it home and feed it to their family without fear that they're going to poison their children with PCBs and mercury or other toxins. It sounds like a pretty good world, right? It's not the world we're living in, unfortunately. But now every year we gather our water keepers together, and once a year in June. Next year we're going to be actually here in Utah, so we're really excited to come bring it back to Utah. And when we bring those groups together, you'll hear all of these amazing stories about their deep connection to waterways. And it always usually starts with their childhood and where that passion came from. And our international water keepers have been telling me the past couple of years that they find it odd that American keynote speakers, American panelists, American speakers don't introduce them first by talking about their personal context to their waterway. So I've been trying to take heed to that, so I'm just going to start with a little bit of a story about where my connection comes from. I grew up in the Susquehanna River watershed in Pennsylvania, and I could go outside my back door and there were lakes and ponds and creeks and streams and rivers. I had to go for days. When I was a young boy, I had a golden retriever named Ben. And Ben and I would go out from May to October. It didn't matter how cold it was. We would go out and we would fish, swim, and spearfish. Of course, Ben couldn't spearfish because of the paws and everything, but he would watch me. And we would go out there and swim, fish, spearfish every day that we could, and being on, in, and around water was happiness and freedom for us. We would then go to my aunt's cabin when I was a child, and we would skip rocks. It was on a river. We would skip rocks, we would canoe, we'd kayak, we'd swim, we'd fish, play cards, ride bikes. And it gave me a whole sense of family and community and further stoked that lifelong passion for water. So I grew up, when I got into being a teenager, I started realizing that not everyone around the world had that same ability and opportunity that I did, that not everybody could just go jump into their local creek and swim because it was poisoned or polluted. And not everybody could just go to the sink and grab a glass of water and drink it. And not everybody could catch a fish and bring it home and feed it to their family. And so I started trying to ask myself, what can I do about that? And what can I do about that in that what I felt was a huge injustice? What could I do to try to make sure that every child could have at least the opportunity to have the type of connection I had to my local waterways? Or what could I do to reverse the injustice of people having their drinking water stolen from them by pollution? So that led me to go to get a law degree in environmental law, and then brought me to Hudson Riverkeeper, where I worked to protect the Hudson River and New York City's drinking water, and then I moved over to Waterkeeper Alliance. So that's my connection, and moving into our story, at Waterkeeper Alliance, we trace our roots and our history back to the 1960s on the Hudson River. But I actually think this story starts earlier than that. So I always like to take the clock back a couple hundred years, and we'll go back to the 1700s and the 1800s in New York. In the 1700s and the 1800s in New York, down in lower Manhattan in the New York Harbor, they had 350 square miles of oyster beds at that time. It was the oyster capital of the world. We actually had half the world's oyster population in New York City, because New York City's always been a maritime city, but a lot of people don't know that it used to be the oyster capital of the world. You could buy oysters off of street carts like people go and buy hot dogs today on the streets. They named streets after the oyster. Pearl Street in lower Manhattan is named after the abundance of oysters. We ate about 1 million oysters a day in the 1800s in New York. And we've got menus back from 1901 from restaurants down by the South Street Seaport that boast a whole variety of oysters that they plucked right from the harbor in their backyard. And we also use those oysters in construction. Some of you might be familiar with the Trinity Church, which is down by the World Trade Center. It was on TV a lot after 9/11. The mortar paste in Trinity Church was made from crushed up oyster shells. But what happened was, as we often do with our natural resources, we didn't take care of the harbor. We overharvested the oysters. We didn't put the shells back into the harbor, which would have made it a great environment for the smaller oysters to attach to. And we polluted the harbor excessively as the city grew. With raw sewage, industrial waste, more and more, to the point where as we got into the early 1900s, people started getting sick from eating the oysters. And some people died. They got cholera and other diseases. So 1920s come around, and they closed the oyster beds, and the oyster capital of the world was no more because of pollution, because of wanton abandonment, reckless pollution. And so that to me is sort of signals the decline, the rapid decline of the harbor and the Hudson River from that point on. And this is by no means unique to New York Harbor or to the Hudson River. This was happening in lots of places. If you were out in Portland, Oregon in the 1920s, stories will tell you that the Willamette River, which runs through Portland, construction workers would refuse to work on construction projects on the Willamette because it smelled so bad. So this was happening in a lot of places, but the good thing is that all of these rivers can be reborn and they can be revitalized. There's a happy ending for them, and it has a common theme that revolves around citizen action. So I'm going to fast forward then. We'll go through the 20s, we go to 1930s, 1940s. The pollution's increasing, the water quality is declining. 1950s continues. By the time we get to the 1960s, the Hudson River, which was an American iconic river, one of our first rivers, it was a it's one of the most biologically diverse and rich rivers in the Atlantic, was left for dead. It was virtually written off as a dead river. It was teeming with life, all of a sudden dead. At that time, Penn Central Railroad was discharging millions of gallons of oil into the river every day. You could tell what color they were painting the cars at the General Motors plant on the river because it would change the color of the river. And there are all sorts of other myriad threats and pollution. The river had become a national laughingstock. It was the butt of people's jokes. Nobody went near the river in the 1960s. Nobody played on the river, went into the river, or went on the river. Everyone that I know grew up in New York in the 1960s would say the only thing they knew about the Hudson River was that it kept New Jersey over there. That was their only use for it. And again, there had been, for generations, there had been blue-collar recreational and commercial fishermen who had used this river. And it had been, they learned how to fish from their parents, who had learned from their parents, and it was a craft that they had planned on passing on to future generations. But this pollution was making it so they couldn't earn a living. They couldn't put food on the table for their family. They couldn't pass on that trade to future generations. And it also was destroying their backyard because that's where they recreated. They didn't have the ability to jet off to Europe or the Caribbean. They went on the Hudson River when they wanted to have a picnic with their family or when they wanted to vacation. And so they were seeing this all taken away from them and stolen from them, and it made them mad. So they organized, and they got together in a Veterans of Foreign War Hall in 1966, and they organized. Now, these were long-standing blue-collar recreational and commercial fishermen. Now, they weren't environmental lawyers, and they weren't biologists, and they weren't environmental scientists, but they knew the rhythm of the river, and they knew there was something wrong with it. They just didn't know how to solve it. So a lot of the fishermen in the room started talking about different ways that they could solve it, which mostly included violence. They said we should take a mattress and shove it up the pipes of Penn Central Railroad and make sure all that oil backs up and floods out the whole factory and the whole yards. They said that they should take dynamite and put it on a raft and stick it up the intake pipes of the power plants because those power plants were sucking up water and killing millions of fish a day and taking it off of their table, and they couldn't feed their family. But fortunately, those ideas got abandoned because there was a man in the room named Bob Boyle. And Bob Boyle was he's a legend in the Hudson River Valley. Bob was the Sports Illustrated outdoor editor, and Bob had done some research. And what Bob found was that there was an 1899 navigational statute called the Rivers and Harbors Act. And that act said that what those polluters was doing was illegal. And there was a bounty provision. If you could secure a prosecution against those polluters, you could get a bounty. So Bob went and he talked to some lawyers, and he asked them if it was still good law and could he use it. The lawyers did some research, and they came back to Bob and they said, yeah, Bob, it's completely valid law. It's never been repealed. The interesting thing is, Bob, it's been in law for more than 60 years. It's never been enforced. After 60 plus years, no one's ever enforced it. So Bob got up at this meeting where everybody's talking about dynamite and mattresses, and he stood up and he held the law and he said, guys, we should not be breaking the law. We should be enforcing the law. And fortunately, those fishermen listened to Bob, and they coalesced around him, and they began this bold quest to take the Hudson River back from the polluters and give it back to the people. They started going around and gathering evidence of these pollution sources. And before long, they got a prosecution brought against Penn Central Railroad. They got a prosecution brought against other industry on the Hudson River to get them to comply with the law and stop polluting. They took their first bounty provision they got and they bought a boat so that they could go and patrol the river and be on the river to take water samples, to take pictures and gather evidence of these different polluting sources and try to find ways that they could solve them. So they started doing this. They were having good success with it. And I want to fast forward now, we get into the 1970s. Of course, 1970 was the first Earth Day when 20 million Americans took to the streets to demand action to be taken for clean air, clean water, and a healthy natural environment. That led to the modern federal environmental law. 28 modern environmental laws were passed federally in the 1970s, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and so many more. The act that the fishermen started using, and that's one of our strongest tools in our toolbox today, is the Clean Water Act of 1972. Now, the Clean Water Act had a really interesting provision in it called the citizen suit provision. What the citizen suit provision said, was that if government who is supposed to implement and enforce the law isn't doing its job, citizens can stand in as private attorney general and bring an enforcement action against the polluter if they won't clean up their mess after you warn them about to clean up their mess. And so that was a really interesting provision that was brought in that has been something we've had to use for many years. And I felt it was very prescient of Congress at the time to do that, as though they were recognizing that money was going to be playing more and more of a role in politics, to the point where many elected officials, not all, but many elected officials are more beholden to those polluting industries that are lining their pockets with cash than to the people who they're elected to represent. So I thought that was a really prescient thing of Congress to do, and the fishermen started using the Clean Water Act throughout the 70s. We get up to 1983, the fishermen formed Hudson Riverkeeper, and they hired their first riverkeeper, a man named John Cronin. And the Riverkeeper concept was based on the public trust doctrine, which is an old doctrine that goes back to Roman times. It's in the Justinian Code. The basic concept is the waterways, the air, these are resources that belong to the public. They don't belong to a polluter. They don't belong to anyone else. They belong to all of us. Great Salt Lake belongs to everybody in this room. It belongs to all of you. It's one of the most important and most valuable things you'll ever own. And the Riverkeeper's job was to be the eyes, ears, and voice for the community that relies on that waterway, and to protect it and safeguard it from violations of the public trust. John Cronin had great success from the very beginning. One of the earliest successes they had, which really helped spur the beginning of this movement and the rebirth of the Hudson, was early on in his tenure, they got an NBC News crew, and they went out on John's boat. He was in this little boat that's not to scale, but it was a small boat. They serendipitously happened upon an Exxon tanker, not to scale, but relative to John's little boat, this massive Exxon tanker, which they saw was discharging from its hull into the river. And John sidled up next to it with his news crew on it, and he was able to get a sample out of a bucket on a pole. And what they realized was that they were discharging petrochemicals into the Hudson River. And the story, after they did a lot of research for a while, they found that Exxon was in Aruba, filling up its tanker, coming up the eastern seaboard, dropping off its product in the New Jersey ports, and then coming up the Hudson to get rid of whatever was left over and dumping it into the Hudson. That wasn't galling enough, as after they dumped out all those poisons into the Hudson, in the estuary portion, they went up past the salt line to where we have fresh water in the Hudson, and they filled the tanker back up with fresh water to steal it, take it back to Aruba, and use it in swimming pools and for other uses because they don't have any fresh water in Aruba. So they were poisoning our river and then stealing water out of our river to take to Aruba. This became a big, massive enforcement action, and it garnered a lot of media and press. So before long, there were other citizens groups around the country that started saying, hey, we'd kind of like to do that on our waterway. We'd like to have that sort of model that John Cronin was doing on Hudson Riverkeeper. So before long, we had a Long Island Sound keeper, and a San Francisco Bay keeper, and a New York, New Jersey Bay keeper, a Delaware River keeper, a Cook Inlet keeper in Alaska, Casco Bay keeper in Maine. And these early leaders of this Waterkeeper movement shared ideas and strategies with each other. They started forming a strong bond with each other. And as more groups wanted to join in, they realized that they should perhaps create an organization that would be a hub in the wheel, that would keep them connected to each other, honor the grassroots nature of the movement, help give them access to resources and trainings, and take their local fights and coordinate them into a global effort. And so after a number of years of figuring it all out and everything, they founded Waterkeeper Alliance. So this was in 1999, they incorporated Waterkeeper Alliance. At that time, we had 34 waterkeepers. There were 33 in the United States and 1 in Canada. Today, as I mentioned earlier, there's now that 34, inspired by that small band of fishermen on the Hudson, has now grown to 302 in 34 countries. And that's what the small band of Hudson Group did. Now, today, also, because of that small band of fishermen and citizen action and laws like the Clean Water Act and citizen action, today, although it faces challenges, today the Hudson River is an icon of ecosystem revitalization. The Hudson River is once again alive. It's been reborn. People are using the river all the time. People are flocking to it instead of fleeing from it. And they're using it with great regularity. It's considered. I travel quite a bit around the globe, and I work with advocates that want to start waterkeepers, and so many of them look to have hope in that story of what the Hudson Riverkeeper was doing, because it was a small group of people that saw there was a problem, and they decided they would take action and take back their waterway. Now that's being emulated around the world into a lot of success. I'll give a quick example. After I left Hudson Riverkeeper to go to Waterkeeper Alliance in 2005, I was asked to go over to Senegal. to visit a group of villagers in Han Village, which is outside the capital city of Dakar. They were interested in starting a Waterkeeper. Now, Han Village is on Han Bay. It's an old artisanal fishing village. It's a village of 40,000 people. There's no sanitation service there. Every villager has an average of 2.3 diseases. There's no internet service. And they lost the ability to fish in their bay a long time ago because it's so polluted. And now fishermen have to take their wooden pirogues, go out into the open ocean. It costs them more in gasoline. It takes them away from their families for longer, and it's very dangerous to be out in the open ocean on those small boats. And they wanted to take back that waterway. And this was the most polluted place I'd ever been, and it probably remains so. If I'm standing here on the beach, to my right is a 30-foot wide open canal of raw sewage coming from the capital city of Dakar, which, as a side note, the capital city of Dakar has a sewage treatment plant that's operating under capacity, but it continues to send its waste to Han Bay. It goes right by the villagers' homes, right through the villagers' homes, through the fish market, into the bay. Right to my left is a massive pipe coming from a Libyan oil facility across from the village. It goes through the village, underneath the village chief's home, discharging directly into the bay. Further to my left is a big pipe discharging a brown noxious fluid that is coming from a meat rendering plant. And then, of course, I mentioned there's no sanitation service in Han Village. So after everyone's done cooking and cleaning, put a bucket of all that waste on top of their head, they go down to the beach, they dump it on the beach. So the beach is just covered with food waste, house waste, and green matting. The village of Han Bay is broken up into football clubs, also known as soccer clubs. And there was a soccer club there called ASC Iraq. And ASC Iraq had been very active in the village with also not only playing soccer, but doing educational programs and helping teach villagers about HIV/AIDS, hygiene, and other social issues. And they had long been wanting to figure out how to reclaim their bay. One of the villagers moved to Toronto, where he learned about Lake Ontario Waterkeeper, and he learned about our Petitcodiac Riverkeeper up in Canada. And he thought to himself, this is what we need on Han Bay. This is what ASC Iraq Soccer Club needs to do. So that's how we got sent over there. And we were over there and met with these wonderful advocates and their charismatic leader named Mbeke Sek. But I said to Mbeke, I don't really know how we're going to be able to support you. I said, you would be the only waterkeeper in the entire continent of Africa. We don't have anybody on our staff that speaks Wolof. We don't have anybody on our staff that speaks French. I don't really know how we can help you. But Mbeke said, no, you have an international model that works and an international brand. I'm going to learn English. He was saying this through a translator, of course. I'm going to learn English, and I'm going to come to your conference every year, and I'm going to learn from veteran waterkeepers like John Weisheit and so many others how they work on these issues in their community, and we're going to bring those strategies back, and we're going to apply them in Han Bay, and we're convinced it's going to work. So we decided to say, let's take a shot at it. And this was in early 2006. Around 2007 or so, we were able to secure them a $10,000 donation from a donor in the States because they wanted to build an internet cafe in their office. Now, the great thing about this internet cafe was that there's no internet service in the village. So they were able to create an internet cafe, which gave them, all of a sudden, made their office the focal point of the village. Everyone came to their office and learned about what was going on in Han Bay, and was able to take personal actions, and also be able to be a greater voice against the government that was polluting their waterway or not enforcing the law. It gave them a voice to the outside world, which kept pressure on governments to want to clean up that waterway. It also gave them a sustainable source of revenue to keep them moving and to be able to do the work that they do. And then the years passed, as promised, and Mbeke learned English. It's far better. He's fluent, far better than my Wolof. He came to our conference every single year since 2006, and he would always go around and talk to all these veteran waterkeepers and learn from them. So the years go by. In 2014, I was in Nepal working with a group of advocates that wanted to start a waterkeeper, and I came back to my hotel that night, and I opened up my laptop, and I saw there was a BBC article that was talking about how Han Baykeeper had been successful in convincing the government of Senegal, the European Development Bank, and a French development agency to commit $68 million to clean up Han Bay. That's what a small little group of soccer village club did in Africa. It was a bit of a teary moment for me. And they, beyond that, in the next year, they all of a sudden spawned a movement of waterkeepers in West Africa. Now there are about 3. There's a whole bunch coming on board in the near future. 1 year later, working with local advocates and local partners, they stopped the construction of 2 coal-fired power plants in their community and their region. On top of that, the $60 million win. So that's all that they've been able to do with citizen action from a small group of villagers from Africa in a community that had no sanitation service, where everyone is laden with disease. They've become a leader in the fight against the pollution that has impoverished the fishermen, sickened their villagers, and has fouled Han-based beaches. So again, whether it's a group of fishermen on the Hudson that are looking to reclaim their livelihoods and take back their waterway, or whether it's a small group of villagers in Africa that's a soccer club, or whether it's everyone in this room who's figuring out a way to forge a clear path forward for these amazing, beautiful natural resources here in Utah, we all have an obligation to try to answer the question, what can I do? We have an obligation to try to answer that question, to be able to think about the kind of future we want. You know, I think about the future a lot because I've got 2 kids, they're 5 and 8. And when I think about the future, I don't want to leave them a mess to clean up or a mess that can't be cleaned up. And really leaving them a better world means giving them the infrastructure like clean air, clean water, and plentiful forests that will support healthy life and reward hard work and ingenuity. And I believe that, you know, I don't want to look back in 20 years and regret that there wasn't more that I could do. I don't want to look back and think, well, maybe it was a mistake to bring them into this world. And I believe we owe future generations to leave behind a better world than what we inherited. And right now we're failing in that moral obligation. There was a quote from, speaking of water, there's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that some of you might be familiar with, where he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And President Obama used that quote in a commencement address in Rutgers University this summer. But he said he agreed with the quote, but he didn't feel like the arc bends on its own, but rather it requires tough action by citizens like us at certain inflection points in history. And so I just want to encourage everyone to ask that question, what can I do? And think about being change agents so that we can create a world where clean water is a given and a reality for everyone, and that we create that world where we treat nature and our environment with dignity for everyone. And I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm really excited about all of the amazing natural resources that you all have here to protect. I know there's a lot of threats to them, but I know there's a lot of really great advocates and people in the room that want to find those solutions. So thank you all for having me here today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the day, and I wish you a wonderful symposium. Thank you.